Ladies and gentlemen, the host for the first panel today, Neelkant Mishra, is a managing director, the India strategist, and co-head of Asia Pacific strategy for Credit Suisse. He's part of the advisory council to the 15th Finance Commission.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. To discuss ideas on rebuilding the economy, we have two eminent panelists who really don't need any introduction. We have Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian. He is currently the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. He is a leading expert on economic policy, banking, and corporate governance. A PhD from Chicago Booth and a top-ranking IIT IIM alumnus. His economic surveys have integrated our rich and economic and spiritual heritage with modern economic ideas, like recently in highlighting ethical wealth creation. Among several other prominent roles, he was also part of the seminal PG&I Committee on PSU Bank reforms, which I think we'll need to discuss today. The other panelist is Dr. Nachiket Moore. He has a PhD in economics from the University of Pennsylvania. His current work is principally focused on the design of national and regional health systems. He has been a member of several high-level expert groups and task forces on health at the center and the state levels, like the Planning Commission's high-level expert group on universal healthcare. In the discussion today, we will learn about his ideas for a model of universal healthcare, among other things. So welcome both. I'll start off with some remarks to set the context on the economy, and then we get into Q&A. As the regulatory restrictions are being lifted, activity indicators are rebounding sharply. So that's quite encouraging. One must say that they were expected to, however. A sharp rebound to 85 to 90% of pre-lockdown levels is underway. This is being aided by pent-up demand in several sectors. But the concern and the fear is that the progress thereafter may be slower. This would be due to a combination of renewed local activity restrictions, like the deaths and the case count are still rising in many cities. There is a fear among individuals of venturing out, and there is also a concern on weak global demand. For example, inbound tourism is nearly 1% of GDP, and that right now is at zero. Further, the loss of incomes and jobs and lower retained earnings in enterprises would be compounded by precautionary savings by both individuals and enterprises. One of the interesting things that any war-like situation, any public panic does, is that even after it gets over, it leaves scars in people's minds and enterprises' minds. And anyone who was aggressively saving was only doing so because he read about it in Jatak Kathas or had been told by his grandfather. In the last 30 years, the people who got awarded or rewarded were the people who aggressively invested and gained the benefits of that. That is not going to happen going forward. And families, likewise, are going to build and rebuild rainy day funds. So it is also possible that some sectors will see strong growth. So we are already seeing things like packaged food. We are seeing areas like, which are benefiting from at-home consumption. So as restaurants are shut, as external calorie consumption, so like ice cream demand is very weak. This is being offset by significant cooking in home, and therefore packaged food production is doing very well. It is going to be confusing for a while as to which indicators are actually representative. But I think there is, for example, even cosmetics can be very weak because people are not stepping out, or party wear. If there are no parties, there's no party wear. There would be expenditure reallocation, and therefore some indicators may show very strong growth, whereas others will stay weak. But I think there's a fair bit of agreement in the fact that aggregate demand would suffer for all the reasons we discussed before. Now, there are many fronts on which action is necessary. In this session, we will focus on three of them. I call them the three healths. The health of the financial sector, which wasn't very great to start off with when we entered the crisis. The health of the corporate balance sheets and the availability of risk capital. And then the health of individuals, which I think has become much more prominent than it was earlier. We will discuss these in sequence, and in the last 10-15 minutes, we will open up for Q&A. So, starting with the discussion on financial sector. So, Subbu, I come to you first. A critical part of the rebuilding process has to be the financial sector. That means that if we and you highlighted how important it is to get growth back, even to get debt sustainability. Now, if we have to grow at 10-11% nominal GDP, we need to get the financial system to grow at 14-15%. And right now, very significant part of the financial system is licking its wounds, is focusing on survival instead of growth. So how do you see this panning out? I mean, will we see more support for NBFCs? Do we see a repurposing of the role of the PSU banks? Do we see new types of financial entities going back to development finance corporations? How do you see this panning out?
So thanks a lot, Neelkant, and a very good evening to all the viewers. Neelkant, as this is a time for reset in many ways, I think it's also useful to take a dip into how the financial sector in India looks vis-a-vis, other countries. In the economic survey this year, we'd actually shown that the Indian financial sector, especially the banking sector, is quite small compared to the size of the economy. And one can look at it in terms of various different measures, be it the number of banks that we have in the global top 100. China, for instance, has 18. We have 1. And we compare with countries like Denmark, even other countries, much smaller countries, which are about 1/7, 1/8 of our size, actually have more such banks. Second way of looking at that is, the presence of small banks, actually those that lend to small firms and individuals in the economy. Here again, it's useful to sort of look at some statistics. Take the US, for instance, a country of about 400 million population has close to 25,000, anywhere between 25,000 to 30,000 banks there. India, with 3 times as much population, has less than 1/10 of those number of banks. Also, one of the things that we've done, through regulation, especially Basel norms, for instance, we've adopted a one-size-fit-all approach where we've relied a lot more on credit ratings, with, in terms for capital. And what they do, therefore, is to sort of, call into question the basic model of banking itself, which relies a lot on soft information. So these are, very, very critical aspects that we need to really work on going forward, because as you would appreciate, credit is extremely important for growth, and growth itself then becomes really critical, not only for basically reducing inequality, etc., but even for debt sustainability. And that is something which we really need to keep in mind. When you look at private credit to GDP, especially the credit that goes to the private sector, India at about 50% of GDP is really an outlier on the negative side. So democratization of credit, especially to MSMEs, to individuals, really needs to happen, and that's something which we need to focus on, going forward, if you really need to get the growth back. Of course, you also referred to the fact that, the initial conditions with which we've entered this crisis in terms of the financial sector have not been, very, very desirable. So that's something that we have to really watch out for. I think this is one sector that I think really is crying out for reforms. Structural reforms, where we really need to be thinking in terms of growing the sector significantly, and unshackling many of the restrictions that we've put, as a result of which the sector is quite small compared to the size of the economy, and especially with the focus on small firms, small individuals, etc.
Thanks. So at this point, let me get Dr. Moore in as well. Sir, your report that you wrote on the financial services for small business and low-income households, something that Subbu referred to as well. And India is actually a country of micro enterprises at this stage. A very large number of people working for themselves, pretty much. And so you looked at a lot of history of how past regulations have addressed this problem. You also made some very interesting recommendations for making this a much more diverse ecosystem than what it has been in just large PSU banks. So what do you think, if you're looking out for the next few years, what do you think should be the priority for policy?
I want to build on what Dr. Subramanian said. He made some very good points about what is the direction the system must take. Clearly, I mean, there is no debate that we have a small banking system relative to our size. We have 60% credit to GDP, just to use one metric, when the number should be at least twice as much. But even more worrying is the fact that this 60% is distributed very unevenly.
Yeah.
If I look at Arunachal Pradesh, that number is under 5%. And UP and Bihar are not that much better off. So not only do we have a small banking system relative to our needs, it's also very unevenly distributed across the system. And then, of course, we have the added problem. We are a somewhat crisis-prone banking system. I've been a banker for several decades. Virtually every decade, you see a reasonable-sized crisis coming to us. So really, in the report that I was a member of, that I chaired, we tried to look at holistically what is going on with the system and what can be done. One level we have to make sure that we do a good job of is that our foundations have to be strong. Some of the unfinished work of bank balance sheet transparency, I think we have to complete. India's we have delayed implementation of. We need to start publishing stress tests. We need to start thinking about risk-based capital allocation, because one of the things that people assume is that you need a bank to push credit out. They have kind of a Keynesian multiplier type thinking behind in their head. But actually, one of the principal tasks of a bank is to allocate credit carefully, particularly when the bond market is not there. So if you do a bad job of it, you have pushed money out, but you have not created growth, nor have you created jobs. And these mechanisms are important to make sure that the banks are making the right decisions, and only those banks that are making those decisions are allowed to actually grow. The second area, you mentioned the issue of DFIs and what to do about them. In the committee, we had spent some time looking at the wholesale banks as an overall structure. I'm fully in agreement that retail banking, we have to worry a little bit about self-dealing and not bring in corporate-owned banks. But wholesale banks allow you to bring high-performing corporate-owned NBFCs into the system. They allow you to focus on some of these infrastructure, long-term lender, while the bond market develops, or as adjacent to the bond markets. And then, of course, stock market clearing corporations. Many countries around the world give them a wholesale banking license so that they don't then have a credit guarantee fund. They can do movement of money and securities instantaneously. It allows also the regulator to step in with LOLR functions. The other thing that it does, coming to the question of SMEs and extending credit, is it then gives you a pathway to take the larger, too big to fail NBFCs into the wholesale banking frame, which means now you can allow the smaller NBFCs to proliferate, to become specialized, because you don't have the fear that if somebody does badly and they fail, you will have a systemic shock. Today, we have a situation in which we have these large NBFCs. We are worried that if they have any shocks, we have no ability to actually rescue them. And then, of course, finally, we have to acknowledge regional disparity in whatever we are doing. Priority lending has been focused on sectors for a long time. And I'm not saying, therefore, that's a bad idea. There is still sectoral disparity. But today, the policy does not officially recognize the fact that sectors have a high level of imbalance. And again, another aspect of banking is we have said to every bank must do everything. If you're an international bank or a local bank or a bank with a lot of branches, with no branches, you must do agriculture, you must do this, you must do that. I think the idea has to be less, let's punish everybody equally, much more making sure that people can specialize, so that in aggregate, the banking system is doing a good job of providing these services. And then also, I don't want you to have the impression that nothing has happened. I mean, we have had progress. The small finance banks are doing well, but clearly, as you point out, we do have several steps we need to take.
Thank you. I think both those are I mean, excellent interventions. Very useful. So if we were to pick one item, so if I was a policymaker, or if you were advising the government on one thing to do, because clearly there is limited bandwidth in terms of the extent of reforms that can be undertaken. What should we go ahead with? I mean, should it be unshackling the PSU banks, because those are an already existing entity? Because I think the problem right now is that the banks that have the savings and the capital do not have the products, and where the products exist, there is a clear problem of a focus on survival, which is the NBFCs. So and one of the reasons why our debt to GDP is so low is high level of informality. So if 44% of your GDP is informal, almost by definition, a very small percentage of that can actually access formal credit. So formal credit to formal GDP is already 90-95%. Now, so how to increase the formalization process? I mean, should it be PSU banks who take the initiative? Should we try to focus on reviving the NBFCs? In my personal view, that may be the best way forward. So, so maybe Dr. Moore, if you would have a preference or a pick on if one of the things had to be done, what would that be?
I would start with a foundational effort. We really need to get the banks to be strong. And if we have limited bandwidth, I don't see why we should have limited bandwidth, because these are all different departments, different divisions of the government, of the Reserve Bank, that can act on them simultaneously. But if we had to do one thing well, I would say make our banks strong. This idea that you can push a bank to push credit out on demand, it just does not appeal to me. We need to make sure that we build the transparency of the bank balance sheets. And that's going to take some effort, but banks are almost ready out there. Now, some of the banks may look less capitalized than we thought they were, but that's, we are just going to acknowledge a reality that exists. It's not as if we're going to make them less capitalized. We're just going to make that visible to ourselves. Then what happens is we can identify truly those banks that are doing a good job of it. Make sure that they are allowed to function well, the capital markets see that they are doing well, so that we direct growth, capital, savings at those institutions that can do the intermediation well, and away from those institutions that have a demonstrated track record of doing a bad job.
Thank you, Dr. Subramanian. If you were to pick one thing that of the large number of things that we need to do, and there's clearly a lot of work to be done, what would that one priority be?
Neelkant, I would actually build on, I think, an excellent point that Dr. Moore made about ensuring that the allocation of credit is done well. In this context, I would actually make two interrelated points. One of the key problems we've had, especially in the allocation of credit, is credit to the large borrowers. We've had repeated instances, of course. Now some of this has come into the open, but even earlier, even in the 90s, we've had situations which would be unthinkable in an advanced economy, where a borrower has serially defaulted and yet ends up getting loans. So it's a flagrant violation of this principle that Dr. Moore talked about, which is that credit allocation has to happen well. We can't be actually giving credit to those borrowers that did not seem to have the willingness to repay. And here's where I think more generally I want to talk about the role of technology and fintech in this area. I draw on my experience. I remember my BTech dissertation, this is decades back, was in applying neural networks to electrical engineering problems. Today, artificial intelligence has built on that, and is able to quantify even several pieces of information that hitherto were just thought to be soft or not quantifiable. We all know about the AI software basically beating Garry Kasparov, in a chess game, which is actually far, far more complicated than the moves that that a willful defaulter might do. So I think in the way in which our banks actually use data for banking, and especially on the corporate lending side, we still are a few decades behind. Not only do we need to ensure that high quality data is collected, but we also need to ensure that those data are actually analyzed in ways that today, there's enormous opportunity to be able to do it. And thereby, and really clamp down on, for instance, just to give examples, this is something that we highlighted in the economic survey as well. If you just use the quality of financial statements, such a strong correlation with willful defaulters, it's a very good leading indicator. Or if you just look at the extent of related party transactions, loans, related party loans, these are all out there, and these are basically, oftentimes in informal conversation, these are mentioned. But today there is the opportunity to be able to actually mine the data to really being able to, direct credit properly. So what I would say, for me, the number one most important, irrespective of the nature of ownership, and I will actually highlight that even the private sector banks, some of those banks that we think are actually at the cutting edge of the technology frontier, I'm actually disappointed to say that that is not the case. When we compare with some of the global peers, even they are far, far behind the frontier in terms of actually the way in which data, technology, AI, data mining, fintech can be used. I think that is, to me, the most important, that we need to do. And hopefully the banks can take a lead, and or maybe even NBFCs, and there can be then sort of osmosis, either forward osmosis or reverse osmosis. But to me, this is the most important. I think today, banks and financial institutions should be thought of as just technology companies and really be able to exploit the benefit of technology. I think that is number 1, 2, 3 for me.
Thanks, Dr. Subramanian. That's I think, if I may add a few more comments on that. So one of the things is, in most global banks, IT departments are more than 50% of the workforce. So if you have 45,000 people in a bank like ours, and I have 25,000 people in IT, that shows how important technology is. And there are many interesting and fascinating. If there is one positive thing that is coming out of even this crisis, is a step jump in digitization. So one of the first things to reach February levels in growth was UPI transactions, and so even the IMPS, which is a UPI is a build up on or a layer on MPS, is actually now growing at 90-100% year on year. And similarly, some of the recent changes on GST, where you can actually allow, with some changes, invoices to be used as collateral. I mean, evidence of cash flows. Is something that can actually allow some of these things to scale up. So now changing back a bit, moving to the second problem, which is that in our in the current environment, the loss of GDP, one hopes that the day you switch on the economy, or the day the economy switches on, everything should come back to what it was in February. But unfortunately, it's not going to be like that. And over and above the scars that we discussed of how people's behaviors, enterprise behavior may change, there's also a reduction in risk capital, meaning that firms which would have generated, so if we are, say, losing 10% of GDP this year, if you're going, say, from plus 6% to minus 4%, which I think is it could be a lot more than that, but even if it's 10% of GDP, the loss to corporate retained earnings could be as high as 5 trillion rupees, I mean 2.5% of GDP. And if you think about 1:1 debt equity that generally gets taken, we're talking about nearly 5% of GDP worth of gross fixed capital formation not happening. And these are things that can have a lingering impact and a lasting impact on growth. Now, in the next 2 years at least, there is clearly a much bigger role for the government than we have seen in the last 30 years, right? Because the government may be the only entity standing. So again, starting with Dr. Subramanian, so one of the constraints in government fiscal action appears to be, so earlier, of course, when there was a lockdown, there was no need for the government. Actually, it may not have had the best multiplier if the government was giving a demand boost. But now that the economy is more or less open, now is the time to supplement demand through government actions. With asset markets globally, with excess money supply boosting stock prices, now you must have seen state governments are now borrowing at yields which are comparable to that of the central government. at short durations. But so these kind of so cheap capital is starting to become available. Do you see growth being the priority of the government from now onwards? And if you could even give the broad directions in which the government may be thinking on how to revive growth.
So, Neelkant, I think growth has been the priority for the government, and I will make comments on the demand side. But let me just use some international experiences to actually highlight why, in times like these, if government indeed has to step in. Whether it actually was the New Deal, that happened under President Roosevelt in the United States after the Great Depression, or if you look at the Marshall Plan, for Europe after World War II, many instances like these, whenever an economy has gone into crisis, of course, the government, has had a crucial role to play, in actually stabilizing the economy and spending, doing the necessary spending. On that, I have absolutely no doubt. I'm very, very clear on it. But, and this is a very important point that, needs to be kept in mind. You, for instance, were referring to the precautionary motive to save. So while there is no denying that the government needs to actually, give work on demand and give a demand side push, getting the timing of that right is also very, very critical to ensure that the bang for the buck is actually maximized. And what am I actually talking about here? As you were saying, because of the precautionary motive to save, and remember that this precautionary motive to save stems from uncertainty, what we economists think about as a second moment. And that uncertainty itself is stemming from the health emergency. Unlike other crises, whether the global financial crisis or any of the Asian financial crisis, LTCM, etc., where the uncertainty stem from economic factors. In this case, the uncertainty is from the pandemic. Until that time, that uncertainty persists. The precautionary motive to save will remain with individuals and with corporations. And this is actually seen, research, for instance, for the United States is showing that the checks that were sent to people have primarily been utilized in essential spending, especially on food. There's been no impact on durable consumption at all. In India as well, if you look at the PMJDY accounts, the balances there have increased by about 18,000 odd crores. Now, remember, these are accounts where the marginal propensity to save is actually very, very low, and yet they've increased by 450 to 500 rupees. In other words, what I'm saying is because of the uncertainty, and Joseph Stiglitz wrote on this as well. If we do this, in sectors where the demand will not pick up because of the uncertainty, the bang for the buck may not be quite right. In other words, I think when the uncertainty actually subsides, that would be the optimal time to actually give the demand side push. In other words, to summarize, what I'm saying is there's absolutely no denying the fact that the government has to be the biggest, role has to play the most important role in the economy and provide a demand side push. But I think the timing of that, just because we've come out of the lockdown, does not mean that the uncertainty has fully gotten over. So we still need to wait for people to resume all normal activities, and then that's when I think the timing will be best for the bang for the buck to be maximized.
Thanks. I'll come. I have some follow up on that. So if I could get Dr. Moore's views as well. So small micro enterprises are likely seeing the worst erosion in risk capital, right? So we are seeing some very large companies now do rights issues. Some of them are getting inbound FDI. The access to bond markets, the yields are now very low. So I think they have less of an issue. How does the government really, a small wholesaler whose markets are still shut because there's crowding, and say, half of Mumbai is right now in containment zones. So the wholesale markets are not functioning, and the poor thing, all of his risk capital is now being consumed in feeding his family, which is of course the highest priority. Now, how do we get these, people with 50 lakh, 1 crore, 2 crore of risk capital, and there are crores of them, to get risk capital to them? Is an aggregate demand stimulus the best way to do it? Because there's no way you can target these millions of small enterprises.
I mean, I'm no fiscal expert. Dr. Subramaniam would be in a better position to answer your last comment. But I mean, certainly during a crisis, what I have seen around the world is a fiscal support is quite important to individuals and to businesses, because what happens to businesses transmits back to individuals in a survival mode. Right? But my sense is that, as Dr. Samaj said, as the uncertainty relating to health starts to subside, and it will, this disease is not a disease that, will kind of cause the shocks that, Ebola or some other contagion would have had it gone to this level. It will take time, but it will subside. The question that I'm a little bit anxious about is what are we doing and thinking about those issues as we plan for that opening. My own thought, and again, in the role I had as a banker, SME was one of the portfolios I looked after. While it is true that the SME sector as a whole is a vibrant, active, important sector, the individual SME is a high risk entity. It has a lot of information asymmetry, and attempting to push cheap credit at them, and by forcing banks to do something or trying to find ways to get equity to them, except as a fiscal relief measure, that's a different kind of approach. I think will be dysfunctional because it will hurt banks. It may not necessarily select, to stay with the theme that we had earlier, the right SMEs that will grow and survive in the environment that emerges tomorrow. Now, you might say, okay, well, we don't do that. Then what are we supposed to be doing? Well, one thing to recognize is that the SME is subjected to a lot of systemic risk. And a better strategy would be to try and understand what can we do about the systemic risk, because you can raise a lot of equity, you can raise default thresholds to say, please go ahead and default because we know you have a lot of systemic risk. I think a better idea is to look at what those systemic risks are. And clearly, for example, payment uncertainties from government corporations, from large companies is an enormous source of systemic risk for the SME. What can we do about that? The TREDS platform is there. Can it be opened up? Can it be made more participative? Why only banks must participate? Why can't everybody participate? Why must it be fully non-recourse? Why can we do, we allow a lot more play in that market. What about demand? For example, we are focused on SMEs directly, but actually, aggregators like Ola, Uber, many of these entities, they take away demand uncertainty. Today, for example, many restaurants are surviving because Swiggy, Zomato, these players are able to tell you where is the demand and give them some assurance of traffic. What can we do to support those entities? Because they are much more amenable to regular structure, and through them, we will get more of this to happen. Operating leverage. Many of these SMEs have, cannot afford large investments. They have a lot of operating leverage. I learned recently about an organization called Hungerbox that, for example, digitizes restaurants. It takes on the fixed costs. The restaurants pay only the variable. And then, of course, finally, this point that I mentioned earlier, that if we are able to deal with the problem of the large NBFCs and allow them to migrate into a wholesale banking type structure, even if they are corporate-owned NBFCs, then we can allow the smaller NBFCs to become much, much more vibrant. Today, we deal with them very conservatively. We insist on excess capital requirements because we think of them as in some form of quasi banks. If we started to worry less about them, we would have actually less pancaking. One thing that people are not, it's not always obvious to people, is that if you look at lending rates of SMEs, that SMEs face from NBFCs, a lot of that comes because they need to service high levels of capital that they are required by regulation to hold. So again, building specialized NBFCs. I've seen in education, for example, in private schools, there are specialized NBFCs have come up. In the US, there is an entity that focuses on primary care NBFCs. Primary care as an SME and an NBFC supporting the growth of that. To me, these approaches seem like more promising ones as we go forward.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. So that's quite fascinating. In fact, that's where the role of pro-cyclical versus counter-cyclical macro prudential measures. So for example, should we be relaxing the debt equity measures for NBFCs or increasing them? And I think those are important questions. So, but both of you highlighted this persistent uncertainty on health, and I think while it is not directly related to economics, but given that this whole crisis has been driven by health, and it has really exposed the differences between countries. I mean, look at Vietnam, how it has dealt with the virus, despite having, I think, resources which are more comparable to ours, or how Taiwan has dealt with it. So one of it is, of course, just the experience of having dealt with pandemics. But if we were to think about healthcare as something that gives the comfort, so Dr. Subramanian talked about the uncertainty which is causing precautionary savings, people have fear. Now, if you had a certain comfort that the infection fatality rate of the virus, for argument's sake, at a certain age group is say 0.2 or 0.1%, and if needed, people will get access to medical care. And that there is sufficient bed capacity, there is sufficient oxygen capacity. And this may not be the last virus, and this is not going away in the next 6 months. I think, including me, I mean, all of us are hoping that this goes away somehow magically in the next 3 to 6 months. But for all you know, it could be around for the next 12, 18 months. And we've seen a new virus every 3-4 years. So should we not, and this is again to address one of the points Dr. Subramanian raised, that because the multiplier is not going to be big enough, is healthcare the sector where government spending, setup of new centers, new hospitals, new diagnostic chains, whatever, so the capital expenditure there will actually have a massive multiplier because it reduces the uncertainty. Now, Dr. Moore, I want to start with you on that. You've written some fascinating posts on how to address universal healthcare in a country which is constrained for fiscal capacity. I would like you to just explain that. I think that's some of those ideas are absolutely fascinating, and then we'll build on that.
Yeah. No, thank you. I completely agree with you that health is an area which I think has surfaced as one of those issues that needs attention. And you're quite right that there is differences between countries in terms of how we have responded, what has happened to these countries. And India, in some cases, has done very well. We have a statewide variation within the country. You mentioned Vietnam. I would have mentioned Kerala, for example. And you can see that there are good responses and there are responses that are found somewhat wanting. And of course, as you said, crisis is not over yet. We will watch and see over the next 12 months how this thing all pans out. What can be done in our country, both near term as well as we think about long term? Clearly, one area we just have to prioritize is public health. We can't be in an environment, we are focused on COVID-19. People are not always conscious that we lose 1,200 people a day on tuberculosis. Something that most other countries, including China, has dealt with quite effectively some time ago. Right? Why is that? Right? We know at least to a reasonable approximation what to do. There is clearly multi-drug resistant TB, all of those issues that we need to worry about, but it's a much smaller proportion. This work is actually quite a bit incomplete. We don't have a surveillance machinery. Where are the epidemiologists? Where is the machinery that tells you how the disease is progressing? We talk about contact tracing, we talk about quarantining, we talk about, how are we going to create containment zones? The public health preparedness, I think, has made a big difference between states and between countries. And I would say this is a real opportunity, and particularly in this case for the government, to look inside and say, we are doing a lot of private health. We are entering spaces, of surgery, of hemodialysis, of many areas. Maybe what we should do is really first finish this task of public health, and also what they call, there is one thing called public health policy, and then there is healthy public policy. Just to give you an example, in Bombay, we have this whole scheme of slum redevelopment housing. Post the bubonic plague in 1896, a rule was passed that between two buildings, there would be a 63.5-degree angle that would make sure that the buildings were, sufficiently far away from each other. And if you go to BBD Chawls in Bombay, you'll see in 1926, they were built fully compliant. If you go to the more recent SRA, the Slum Rehabilitation Act buildings, Natwar compound, for example, that entire rule has been ignored. And somebody did some very nice research that showed us that the level of TB changes based on the floor you live in. People on the lower floors have higher incidence of TB than people on the on the lower floors have higher incidence of TB than people are living on the higher floors. We just, we really have to sit down and fix this issue in a comprehensive manner. That is how we will prepare ourselves for pandemics. Second issue, now you might say, well, there's lots to do. And as you pointed out, we in India, and we are not alone, Nigeria is a country that has had oil revenues for a long time. They are in a similar boat. Fiscal capacity is not there, or there are other priorities that call attention. So governments have not spent the amount of money required. I continue to believe that this is something they should do. Many countries have done it. Thailand has done it. China has done it. But it will require a tripling of health expenditure, not small amounts of 5, 10, 15,000 crores here and there. That will take us time. In the meanwhile, and this is what I've been writing about, we have been, I feel, somewhat ignoring the fact that people of India are spending a lot of money on healthcare. How can we add value to that process? And I believe a lot can be done. For example, in Singapore, the idea of the catastrophic health insurance, very high cost procedures. Every citizen has that insurance. Now, in our markets, we can enable creating these. And the good thing about these insurance program is because they may be high cost diseases, because the probabilities are low, the actual premium is quite low. How can we universalize so that every single household has access to this catastrophic insurance product? It could cost 25, 30,000 crores, well within the means of the government, but if the government chooses not to spend on it, there are ways in which we can activate private markets. Then I would say, what about primary and secondary care? We really need to strengthen that. Even in this crisis, one of my concerns has been that we followed a strategy of what I call, centralize, hospitalize, ventilate, when we knew worldwide that those strategies were not working very well. What about distributed oxygen capacity? What about making sure that every small clinic and maternity home had a simple 40,000 rupee oxygen concentrator that allowed you to give you 5 liters of oxygen for anybody that needed it? You're hearing horror stories of old parents running around trying to find basic oxygen. I feel that the whole primary care infrastructure needs attention. And, we don't have enough time to get into it just now, but I do believe that there are viable, interesting ideas coming from business schools, from other businesses that we can learn from to actually figure out that even in an out-of-pocket environment, government doesn't have the money. If they did, we have other tools. We can actually build good primary and secondary care. So I would say strong public health, universal catastrophic insurance, and a really robust approach to building a high-quality network of primary and secondary care, assuming out-of-pocket expenditure.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. I wish really we had more time to discuss that. And I want to pick Dr. Subramanian's brains on some of the things that you mentioned. So when you talked about the fact that SRA, the distancing norms are not being met, there are issues around, too over-regulation of building, etc., and why buildings take 2 years to build and therefore add to the cost, etc. But I think those are very important points because, one of the ways in which or the point at which the disease spread in Mumbai seems to have slowed is when 10% of the population left, right? So the migrant workers leaving Mumbai, I think, add up to 10%. I would say even more. No one knows the number. And the decongestion of the chawls and the slums was very important for this to happen. Now, is this an opportunity in a sense that people now realize that living in congestion, therefore the social acceptance of rebuilding, the social acceptance of moving to better quality, affordable housing, and therefore as a multiplier, if you think about another government boost I know these are state subjects, both health and residential real estate, but a government boost to affordable housing, a renewed push on that, and not just house ownership for all, but just housing for all, meaning you can even rent facilities and you can have people investing in 1,000, 2,000 tenement buildings and then renting them out. So are these fiscal options that the government can consider? Dr. Sugawande.
So, Neelkant, I actually want to, string together some of the thoughts that Dr. Moore has highlighted on healthcare. And I think one of the key points that has emerged during our discussion is the fact that there is undeniably uncertainty on the health front, and it's not restricted only to the current episode of COVID. In which case, then, reducing uncertainty itself, can create enormous benefits. And that's where I think I would bring together three key aspects. One is, insurance. We all recognize that insurance is something that will really reduce, uncertainty significantly. A second aspect that I think is very important is focusing a lot more on prevention. And here's where, again, I want to pick up the example of what we've been doing, in the COVID pandemic, and relate to what something that has been there in our, culture, which is, you step out of your house, you come back. As a young kid, I always used to be told, wash your hands, wash your legs, and change your clothes. Now, these were things that were part of our culture. The reason I'm bringing this up is to link it to, something that we wrote about in the July 2019 economic survey on nudge, the behavioral economics of nudge. When you have practices that have been part of your culture, it is very easy to tap into those to nudge people, and that can play a significant role in prevention. And prevention thereby can be utilized to reduce this uncertainty. For instance, now a lot of immunity boosters are being talked about, but one would expect that immunity boosters should be something that we all invest in at the micro level, even in normal times, and because that enables prevention. A third part is something which is related to, again, what Dr. Moore mentioned, which is the out-of-pocket expenditure that happens, and really, in fact, that is what oftentimes leads to debt traps for really poor people, and that's where I think the insurance aspect, some of the preventive medicine can be really useful. Of course, I think we also need to increase the fiscal spend on this. But even within the spend that happens between the center and the states, it's quite dispersed. We can still bring them together, and thereby, for instance, bringing together defense spending on healthcare, CGHs, railways, bringing them together can also give us enormous bargaining power, and thereby be able to actually, bargain as possibly a monopoly, and thereby being able to make, healthcare far more affordable to the masses, and thereby reduce uncertainty at the macro level of the economy as well. So these are, I think, one key thing that has happened. As they say, there's always an opportunity in a crisis. That the role for these, whether it's insurance, whether it's actually bringing together various arms of government or focusing on prevention, the role that they can play in reducing health uncertainty, I think, has really been underlined through this crisis.
Yeah. So thank you. I think those are all excellent points. And again, I wish we really had more time, but now we have to open up for audience Q&A. I believe we have a question from Mr. Ravi Suryanarayan. Mr. Suryanarayan, can you go ahead, please? Sir, you're on mute.
My question is really, twofold. One is on the institutions, looking to our banks. And I know banks' problems have been lingering for a long time. We are addressing it by merger, etc., etc. But one chief thing which I think is not getting addressed is lending to services. And our economy is turning towards services. There may be a lot of models in the books, but nothing has come out to Bazaar. And banks are, I don't know if banks are really the instrument through which you can reach cash flow based financing to the services industry, or it should be through an NBFC model. But I think there we are kind of delaying, and there is no model which is known to the Bazaar, to the SME people, that yes, they can get cash flow based financing, which is not based on security. The banks are overly obsessed on kind of security, collaterals and stuff like that, and that's not really helping. So there is a problem in credit delivery which is at root, and it requires some systemic reform on cash flow lending, which I'm not sure which is getting addressed, and it is getting communicated, that the address is getting communicated. That's one part of my question. The second part of my question is really building up on Dr. Subramaniam's demand booster to wait for getting the best buck out. Is that, I'm not a great expert. I'm sure they are expert and they would have applied my mind, but as a common man, should we not start ahead? And there are a lot of things on government procurement. Do we look at it really like a private capitalist to say that I have to maximize the bang on the buck, or is it to get prop up, because it's going to be a time-consuming affair. It's not that you put money and you can into the system and you can expect results. You have to start ahead, and therefore is there in the government procurement systems. The tendering systems are really cumbersome for SMEs to participate in them. There are a lot of systemic reforms and stuff like that. So is that something which we need to look at the systemic level? These are two of my questions. Thanks.
Okay, Dr. Subramaniam, do you want to address at least the second part? First question I didn't understand, but it was a good statement, but it was a statement where I didn't get the question. But second part, clearly, I think there was a question to you.
No, Neelkanth, I think there was a good question even on the first part, which is I think the case is absolutely correct that almost 90% of our lending is secured lending, and what I spoke about earlier, the use of technology, analytics, etc., to enable cash flow based lending. I think that's something which is a very, very good point. While I definitely see role for the government and regulators as well, but I also see significant role for the private sector. This is a space that is waiting to be disrupted, and I hope that a lot of fintech companies are working on utilizing this, because India is a more service oriented economy, and so cash flow based lending, using analytics, using transaction level data to actually infer both ability to repay and willingness to repay is work done. Your second question, I think, again, see, this is, we don't have the time for a nuanced discussion, but what I'm trying to say, I'm not denying there is absolutely very, a crucial role for a demand side push. I gave the examples of the New Deal. I gave the example of, the Marshall Plan as well. What I'm saying is that some sectors where the demand, take tourism, for instance, till the time that the uncertainty is there, it's unlikely that the demand is going to come back. And so, one has to think about, I do certainly agree with you that we are definitely preparing for it undeniably, and trying to front load, for instance, infrastructure spending, because we know very well infrastructure, because it relates to construction activity, a lot of jobs are created. And so employment has to be a key aspect of the demand side push, because if there are layoffs and retrenchment, that can have an impact on demand as well. And that's why a lot of the measures that we've taken on the liquidity side, focused on MSMEs, are really to ensure that demand is retained, at least for a lot of the essential items and for many of the discretionary sectors as well. So to summarize, I think we are certainly aware of the need for a demand side push, and the fact that government has to play a key role. We've already taken steps through preserving employment and giving a lot of liquidity to the MSMEs, in the earlier kind of measures, and we are working on measures currently. What is critical to recognize is that, even if you put cash in hands of people, it may not translate into a buying of a car or buying of a house, because people will say, I might possibly need that money for healthcare expenses. So that's the point that you have to recognize. That's the timing, that's the aspect of timing that I'm actually referring to.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question is from Mr. Satyam Vyas. Mr. Vyas?
Yes. Hi, thank you so much for a very, very insightful discussion and comments today. My question is to Mr. Subramaniam or Dr. Nachiket Moore or Dr. Subramaniam. So I'm a founder of a social enterprise called Arthan. We build capacity of civil society organizations in India. So civil society approximately employs 7 million people and supports government in addressing some of the most complex challenges as we know. And we noticed a lot of that during the COVID pandemic. So there are reports and estimates that the funding for the civil society is going to go down by 30 to 60%. That might mean that 2 million people approximately are going to lose their job. So my question to Dr. Subramaniam is, recently a stimulus package was announced for MSMEs by the government. Shouldn't there be a stimulus package for civil society organizations?
I think this is a difficult question. Undeniably, there are sectors, not just MSMEs, but other sectors, as I was mentioning about tourism, for instance, which possibly need attention. At this point in time, we focus primarily on ensuring that MSMEs, which account for almost 98 to 99% of the overall employment, overall number of firms as well. So we focused on giving them a lot of attention, ensuring that employment impacts are minimized thereby. I do want to point out that I think this is a broader point that must be kept in mind, and this is again I say this based on behavioral economics. Yes, that some of these statistics that you're mentioning I am paying attention. We should pay attention to it. But at the same time, there is also something that you should keep in mind more broadly, which is what behavioral economics call the saliency bias, which is when we are in a time when in normal times we do not think that a black swan event is probable, and when we are in a black swan event like this, we don't think that we'll be back to normal times, and that's what oftentimes can lead to a lot of very pessimistic projections as well. I'm not denying that we are in a difficult time, but as Dr. Moore, somebody who actually understands health,
Okay, I think so. We are seeing some bad connection. We're quite fortunate it's happening right at the end. But maybe we can get Mr. Kilachand's question in while we wait for Dr. Subramanian's connection to improve.
Hello, thank you, Dr. Mishra. And this question actually is for Dr. Subramaniam. So I don't know whether his connection has come back or not. And the question really is that over the last 8-10 weeks, there seems to be a convergence, amongst leading Nobel laureate economists, the leading economists at the IMF, the World Bank, and of course, leading economists at some of the, major global academic institutions on a direct cash benefit transfer. And that number seems to be somewhere around rupees 7,000 per month. Now, obviously, I've heard Dr. Subramaniam say that demand side stimulus, could be a timing issue. But there seems to be, and these are all colleagues, I'm sure, of people in our finance ministry and Council of Economic Advisors and RBI, who are, obviously being trained in these same institutes. There seems to be a resistance on the part of our government not to listen to these voices. So the question is why?
Okay, now I'm not sure if either Dr. Moore or myself are qualified to address this question. And anyway, I think I'm afraid we have run out of time. So so at this point, and we've lost connection with Dr. Subramanian. So we'll try to get that answer to you, Mr. Kilachan. And on that count, let me thank Dr. Moore and in absentia, Dr. Subramanian for joining us in this fascinating panel. And I look forward to this continuing this discussion offline as well. Thank you very much for looking at the show. And
thank you very much for having me.
One of the biggest challenges India faces is in the area of providing equal opportunities to all sections of society. Skill development is one initiative which brings equal opportunities to all.
Pan-IIT Alumni Reach for India Foundation, headquartered at IIT Bombay, partners with state governments through non-profit, joint venture enterprises to create an institutionalized skill development architecture exclusively for the underserved across all districts of the state. The first such special purpose vehicle or SPV was created with agencies of welfare of the government of Jharkhand. The Pan-IIT model of skill development is predicated on assured placement, 100% skill loan financing, best-in-class training and residential infrastructure led by ex-army personnel. The foundation runs Gurukuls with 2 to 3 month training in construction, logistics, manufacturing and Kaushal colleges imparting 1 to 2 years of trade licenses vocational education in trades like nursing, catering exclusively for the underserved.
बहुत अच्छी ट्रेनिंग आपको मिल रही है। आप सौभाग्यशाली हैं कि आप देश के इस हुनरमंद काम को बढ़ाने वालों में सबसे अच्छी संस्थाएं हैं जो 3-4 उसमें से एक मैंने मैं अनुभव किया। भारत सरकार का मंत्री बोल रहा है तो कहीं बहुत अच्छा काम यहाँ होता है।
कॉन्फिडेंस हमको गुरुकुल दिया है सर के एस्पिरेंट जो निकल के गए हैं वो अच्छी नौकरी भी कर रहे हैं और गुरुकुल के एस्पिरेंट्स विदेश तक गए हैं।
आज अगर गुरुकुल में अगर नहीं होता, ना ही मैं दुबई को देख पाता, ना ही मैं 35 से 40 हजार में कमाता।
ये नर्सिंग कौशल कॉलेज है और मेरी फैमिली कंडीशन उतना अच्छा नहीं है कि इसमें लोन प्रोसेस के द्वारा पढ़ाई कराई जाती है जिसमें कि घर से पैसे नहीं लगते हैं। कॉलेज बहुत अच्छा है क्योंकि इसमें फैसिलिटी ज़्यादा है और यहाँ थ्योरी क्लास के साथ साथ प्रैक्टिस पर ज़्यादा ध्यान दिया जाता है कि इसमें हाई टेक्नोलॉजी के द्वारा पढ़ाया जाता है। जैसे कि सिमुलेटर है, यहाँ वार्ड बनाए गए हैं जैसे प्रैक्टिस वार्ड है, ICU वार्ड है।
Some of the studies have proven that if we use something like a helmet patient interface, the device which we have developed, lungs problem which lot of patients face can be assuaged and the patients can recover faster and better. That has been proven in some studies.
Ladies and gentlemen, the host for the next panel today, Ajit Rangnekar, is the former Dean of Indian School of Business and presently the Director General, Research and Innovation Circle of Hyderabad and partner at Social Venture Partners.
Good evening and welcome to Pan-IIT Global E-Conclave. My name is Ajit Rangnekar. With me today are three eminent thinkers, and we are going to discuss rebuilding higher education. Let me first start by introducing them. I'll start with Dr. Anil Kakodkar. Dr. Anil Kakodkar is currently the chairman of Rajiv Gandhi Science and Technology Commission, former chairman of Atomic Energy Commission and secretary to the Government of India, also the chairman of Board of Governors at IIT Bombay between 2006 and 2015. He has worked on the development of atomic energy program in India throughout his professional life. The focus of his work has been on self-reliant development of nuclear reactor systems. For his achievements in the field, he was awarded Padma Shri in 1998, Padma Bhushan in 1999, and Padma Vibhushan in 2009. It's indeed an honor to have you with us, sir. He obtained his BE Mechanical degree from Bombay University and MSc from Nottingham University in '69. Also joining us all the way from Boston is Dr. M.S. Vijay Kumar, who has been providing leadership for sustainable technology-enabled education innovation at MIT for the past 20-odd years. He's currently MIT's Associate Dean for Digital Learning and Executive Director of the Jameel World Education Lab, which is doing some amazing work in developing countries. Dr. Vijay Kumar is a member of the Faculty Advisory Committee of MIT's Open Courseware, which is of course all where the new things are happening. He has served as the Executive Officer of MIT's Council for Education Technology. He currently co-leads CLIX, a Tata MIT initiative for educational quality and access. He did his BTech in Chemical Engineering and MS in Industrial Management from IIT Madras and received his PhD from University of Massachusetts. He is a recipient of the Distinguished Alumnus Award from IIT Madras. The third panelist, my dear friend, BVR Mohan Reddy, is the Executive Chairman of SCIENT. Mohan is a visionary who actually moved away from normal IT services to doing global engineering R&D services. He started SCIENT in 1991, has been the past chairman of NASCOM in 15-16, was the chairman of CII Southern Region, currently chairman of CII Education Council. He, along with me, was the founding director of T-Hub, the largest startup incubator in the country. He has taken several leadership positions to promote higher education. He's chairman of the board of IIT Hyderabad, member of the Leadership Advisory Board at University of Michigan's College of Engineering, also member of the Court of Governors at Administrative Staff College. Mohan received his Padma Shri in 2017. He's a recipient of the Distinguished Leadership Award of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, Distinguished Alumnus of the IIT Kanpur, Fellow of the Institution of Engineers. He holds his postgraduate degrees from IIT Kanpur and also Michigan. It's a phenomenal panel. So let me start by setting something of the background so that then we can have a discussion. And by the way, my system and my Wi-Fi has not been behaving too well today. So if I suddenly drop off, please don't panic. The rest of the team will continue. They are the thinkers. I'm only the moderator. So if we start with the assumption that the purpose of higher education, for each one of us, we have our own purpose. We want to do something, that's why we study. We are all driven by our own something internal. But for a nation, the purpose of education in general and higher education is particular, is to create a better and a responsible society. And what does a responsible society mean? It's one which has good governance, which provides all the basic necessities of food, shelter, health, cleanliness, hygiene, security, but also provides for equity and freedom of thought and action. It has to make that a robust industry which is globally competitive. It must ensure global living standards in terms of environment, culture, entertainment, etc. And it must provide each one of us opportunities to do what we want within the law, including, very importantly, wealth creation. Right? Now, no society can do all of these all together at the same time. So what has happened in India is, from independence, initially, the focus of our education, everything we did, was on nation building and self-reliance. From 60s to 80s, we took a shift towards wealth redistribution, socialism, and import substitution. And when that did not work, from 90s onwards, we have focused essentially on wealth creation. But what is happening now? See, the globalization and the wealth creation and globalization predominantly benefited the wealthy and the middle class. The educated middle class was amongst the biggest beneficiaries of globalization. However, we somehow were not able to carry the poor with us. So the poor in many countries got left behind. Also, what happened in developed countries, the poor actually suffered because their jobs went to other countries like China, India, etc. So today what's happening is many of them are now pushing back and says, no, we want our share, and globalization therefore is not an answer. So the people who are taking charge in different parts of the countries are all asking for an equity is the bigger this thing. Doubling, greater focus on rural development in India and so on and so forth. And these are all genuine, correct requirements. Then what has happened is, thanks to COVID especially, but also all the political changes that have been happening recently in Ladakh and elsewhere, we are realizing that having one central and only one global manufacturing base is simply unsustainable and is politically dangerous. And therefore, we are all re-examining our past global manufacturing strategies. At the same time, on the positive note, a large number of technologies, not just digital technologies, but robotics and a whole lot of other technologies in agri and life sciences are all giving us an opportunity to actually improve the world. So that is the opportunity. And in all of this, it's not just the disadvantaged people who are pushing, but it's also the young who are saying, we want a cleaner world. You are destroying our future and you cannot do that. So that is the framework under which we have to look about reimagining higher education. So what are the options we have? What are some of the things we shall do, etc., etc.? I'm going to first start by requesting Dr. Kakodkar to give his view. After that, I'll go to Professor Vijay Kumar and then to Mohan, BBR Mohan Reddy, after which we will open it up for questions. So over to you, Dr. Kakodkar.
Thank you, Mr. Rangnekar. Happy to be here along with Dr. Vijay Kumar and Dr. Mohan Reddy for this conversation on rebuilding education at this Pan-IIT Global E-Conclave on nation building. Before I get into some of the topics which Mr. Rangnekar initiated, I want to first say that today is Guru Purnima, a special day to talk about education. We pay our respects to teachers on this day. Actually, education is a subject on which I think maximum number of reports have been written. And it's very difficult to say something new. But the fact remains that it is the teacher who makes the difference and can make all the difference on the education landscape. Having said that, let me come to the discussion proper. To my mind, in the Indian context, we need to look at education as a key enabler on several counts. First, bridging disparities. And within that, we have to recognize that we have to address several divides. The rich-poor divide, the urban-rural divide, and of course, bridging the gap between where we are today in India in terms of global competitiveness and to be a top competitive nation in the world. Now, I think we need to bridge all that. We are well placed in terms of our demographic dividend. Rising middle class has shown how big difference education can make to the economy and growth of the country. We still have to address this question about the urban-rural divide because education penetration in rural areas and its role in raising the standard of living of people there is, I think, still an issue, and we need to talk about that. The second aspect where education becomes a key enabler is this question of comprehensively embracing new age society as we are migrating from the industrial era to knowledge era. We have to be competent participants into this new age society. And while we adopt technologies to be able to do that, I think we must make sure that the society remains humane and not becomes enslaved with the technology, because that's a great danger. And that, I think, is an important role education needs to play. The third aspect, again, role of education as an enabler, in my view, is this question of holistic education that emphasizes an ecosystem for group learning or group research, problem-solving ability, competitive technology, and most importantly, simultaneous attention to jobs, growth, and sustainability. Now, it is this last three which many policymakers believe are impossible to be realized at the same time. And as the COVID situation has told us, that unless we realize that, there will be problem. Either there will be problem on the jobs front, or there will be problem on sustainability. So I think we need to rethink the whole framework of policy, whole framework of economy, the way it is built, so that we are able to do all the three things together: the jobs, growth, and sustainability. The fourth thing in this category, as education as a key enabler, is a change in the cultural mindset. To my mind, we Indians traditionally, we are deeply embedded in silo mentality. Sorry to say that, but I believe that is largely true. It's changing, but we need to actually get rid of that and get into an environment where we can do a lot of things with people with complementary capabilities, across the discipline. Now, I would say these are the objectives that we need to realize or leverage education to realize those. But there are some specific actions that I want to talk about to realize these objectives. Number one, we need an education model that can address the issues of access, as was alluded to, and quality, and also mobilize necessary resources. In India, we have this flourishing coaching class industry today. Now that, in terms of its turnover, has become nearly as large as government budget on education. Can we see a different configuration of resource mobilization between public and private funds that makes education more holistic in terms of knowledge gathering, along with relevant skills, situated work-based learning, better problem-solving capability, and assured livelihood? I think that's a challenge, because today, not that money is not there, but I think it is causing more harm than good. And of course, you can't blame it, because it has become so competitive, cutthroat competition, that children do rush to get into the IIT and JEE and what other domains, because there are so few opportunities. So we need to look at that landscape. The second important thing that I think we need to look at, obviously, and there are experts on technology on the panel, so I will not say much, but technology would clearly be an important part of the toolkit for education. Education models need to recognize limitations of current infrastructure and resources. Even if we get all the technology, I think we need to be conscious about our ability to deploy in the infrastructure that we have, particularly in the rural or interior parts. There have been several experiments being done by different people. While there is a problem of connectivity in some parts, people are talking about utilizing television, computers, laptops, and handheld devices, mobile and all together. And I think it's a new paradigm, and I think there is enough expertise available, and we need to see how to pull it together in an affordable manner. But one thing is clear to me, that things have to change on technology front. I think the current framework, in my mind, is soon likely to become actually irrelevant. So we need to think quickly. And in the context of COVID, obviously, the urgency has become even greater. The next point that I wish to make is the need to make education more holistic. I touched upon this. And make that education a part of ecosystem involving technology-enabled.
I think we seem to have lost Dr. Kakodkar. Have we? Hello? I think we have lost Dr. Kakodkar. So I think in some ways, Vijay, this is a great segue into what you were going to say, because he's talking about, making education reach out to masses, making using technology. So I'll hand this over to you, and maybe you can take it up from there.
Greetings, everybody, and thank you, Mr. Rangnekar, Ajit, and Mohan. You set the context up very well. For me, it's a pleasure and a real privilege to be in this distinguished company addressing this very, very important topic, that of rebuilding. And rather than leaping into solution, because the demand side has been articulated so well by both Ajit ji and Mohan ji, I want to just set context a bit. This house that I'm talking to you from was built in 1927, and so it's old. And in 2004, we remodeled this house, built some extension, etc., etc. Last week, it rained torrentially over here. I went to the basement and it was flooded, right? And what we had not done, there are some cracks in the foundation that we had never attended to. And when we remodeled this place, we never attended to those foundational cracks. So there was a lot of extensions, some features came in, etc., but a core problem never got addressed, those cracks. So in a similar fashion, I believe when we talk about rebuilding, we really have to think about some of these enduring problems, and you articulated them, these cracks, and they are largely, you can encapsulate them as equity, access, quality problems. And what COVID has done, and we have found out, is it has exacerbated, it has exaggerated, and we can see one of the, it's a very unfortunate term, features of COVID, that it has unsurfaced, it has opened the kimono on some of these perennial problems of education, of educational equity. And so when we talk about equity and we talk about quality, first of all, an assertion, those of you, who are familiar with my background, my work, I am an unabashed optimist. I believe that prudent, judicious combinations of what we call digital learning technology, learning sciences, and the principles of open education provide a real potent force for the kind of disruptive innovation that is absolutely essential to address these cracks of equity, of quality at scale. So we talk about access and we talk about quality at scale. And one of the things I like to point out, and we're all among scientists and engineers, so this is always challenged when I mention it. When I refer to scale, I talk about scale as not being a scalar, but being a vector which has both magnitude and direction. So when we talk about scale, or providing education at scale, or quality at scale, we think about doing something and making it widely distributed to people. What we forget is that the learners that we're trying to get to, and particularly pronounced now, they come with different preparation, they come with different motivation, they come with different infrastructure challenges, where they are. So, they're locationally challenged, they're vocationally challenged. So the scale is not taking one thing and providing it to millions, but to see how can we provide different kinds of opportunities with different kinds of contexts in terms of preparation, motivation, in terms of where they need to go and where they are in their life, where they are physically, geographically. So it is about providing many things to many, many different kinds of people, differentiated learning opportunities. So scale as a vector becomes a very important thing. And I believe this concept, so that's in the scale as who you reach in the denominator. The other thing is about quality. And I want to say a couple of things about when we talk about quality, providing quality learning opportunities at scale. And both, Mr. Rangnekar and Mr. Mohan Reddy actually talked about it very nicely, because we are talking about quality. The properties of quality learning are to say, not just, we talk about active learning, hands-on learning, but one of the most important qualities is about relevance to the workforce. And I'm not talking about just being responsive to the workforce, but being generative in creating new opportunities, in creating new kinds of possibilities. So quality has to be seen in terms of not only just absolute content, but what we are teaching, what people are learning in terms of the relevance to informing the workplace, informing the economy, to be able to, with agility, respond to new opportunities. But I think in countries, such as India, actually anywhere, but I see this more in developing context, the opportunity to generate new economies, new kinds of opportunities, the generative tendency, and it's variously described as having entrepreneurial tendencies or whatever. So we have to think about quality, and the two other dimensions, which Dr. Reddy pointed out, which I cannot overemphasize, is this notion of citizenship and what we say compassion. We are working with refugees teachers in Jordan, and it's not about just providing tools and techniques, but providing the agency, the confidence, so that they can actually employ them and make it different for themselves and for others around them. So this notion of empathy, compassion, and so we have to think about quality differently, and we certainly have to think about scale differently if we want to address our aspirations around equity. So that's on the demand side. On the supply side, what I say is, again, this potent combination of digital. And again, when I say digital technology, it's not just taking what we are doing on site and transplanting it online. We saw in the immediate aftermath of COVID, for business continuity reasons, everybody was going online, and you can clone inadequacy. In fact, if and when we have time, I can tell you some interesting stories, about what going online without thinking about it. And I believe we actually miss the opportunity if we don't see this as an opportunity to re-engineer what we do with technology. So keeping these kinds of things in mind. In fact, we look at learning science as a very, very important player in this equation. Learning science, where we're learning so much about how the brain functions, how learning happens in different contexts, which allows us to judiciously combine digital or technology with on-site and online, so that we can provide these differentiated, different kinds of learning opportunities for people, for different kinds of people. And this becomes something very, very important, because when you talk about digital, it is certainly about networks and technological infrastructure. Digital is about data. Digital is about the affordances that AI creates to provide much more tailored, customized learning opportunities, being able to map concepts to labor market needs, being able to do much more formative interventions for better learning opportunities. So digital is hardware, software, and digital becomes a method by which to easily and at scale implement what we learn from learning science. And then, of course, what openness does in terms of principles and policies so that we can have a systemic orientation towards large-scale change. So I'll stop with that. I wanted to paint this context of thinking about how we really need to understand foundational problems and why I am so bullish, perhaps in a Pollyannish way, on this opportunity, because I think what we need, and Aditya, you really, you made a reference. What we need is disruptive innovation. It can't be innovation around the edges. And when I say disruptive, it means some structural, things that we have taken for granted, say between access, cost, and quality, between the learner, the institution, and resources. All those structural relationships can be positively challenged and reconstructed, and that's what will lead to the kind of equity and scale we're talking about.
Great, lovely. I wouldn't be surprised if people in the audience actually think that we have pre-planned this and this whole flow is going, because this is another perfect segue to Mohan, because we are talking about disruption, we are talking about how to make it on scale, we are talking about quality, and everything that Mohan has been thinking and working about. So over to you, Mohan.
To all the gurus. It's indeed great pleasure to be here on the Pan-IIT panel today. I'm also very conscious of the time at this point of time. And so therefore, the speakers were ahead of me, very well articulated. Professor Kakodkar, Professor Vijay Kumar, Professor Rangnekar, all of them have painted all the scenarios at this point of time. So therefore, I'll try to be as brief as I can, and I'll jump into something which I think are the priorities. What I see at this point of time is there are two major challenges that we have. One is the technology. Technology is accelerating and amplifying at a pace the human beings have never experienced so far. And so also, we are in the middle of a major disruption because of the COVID crisis. The locking, unlocking, and locking, unlocking continues to be a sinusoidal waveform in many parts of the world, including India, and there are several examples that we can talk about. But also, in the middle of these things, there's a huge opportunity also that comes in, and that is what was announced by the government as the Atmanirbhar Bharat, because that's a huge opportunity to me. And that part, as earlier this evening, stated by me, but it so happened by coincidence, the Vice President of India, Mr. Venkaiah Naidu, talked about it's all about self-reliant economy. It's not about protectionism. It's not about isolation. It's certainly making sure that we use this as a launch pad for furthering entrepreneurship and innovation. Truly, I think that is what is a key for us as a major opportunity in front of us. So therefore, what I would do now is that I think there are three things, and I think Professor Kakodkar mentioned very well, that there's so much amount of it has been written and said so far about education. And so also, three of the speakers ahead of me articulated it very well. So I will get into that part. So given the situation that we are in, the opportunity that is ahead in front of us, glaring at us at this point of time, Atmanirbhar Bharat, what are the three things that we should be doing? The first one that I think is that we need to foster innovation, incubation, and entrepreneurship at the level of our higher education schools. I happen to teach a class on entrepreneurship that's actually more precisely on leadership at IIT Hyderabad. We get about 76 students there. But if you ask them how many of them want to truly become entrepreneurs, not many hands go up thereafter. But then the challenge we have further ahead of us is that we all talk about the demographic dividend at this point of time, which actually will peak out in another 15 years. By, I believe, 2035, we'll have 65% of Indian population, which will be in the working group of 15 to 59. So therefore, there is enormous amount of need at this point of time to see that we can probably, educate our people well, and equally importantly, create enough of jobs. Therefore, there is a need for us to create more amount of employment, or instead of saying we look forward to job seekers, then we need to certainly look forward to people who will create more amount of jobs. That requires actually a big shift in our education system. Our rote learning should go away. We should probably, as I think one of the reports that I was reading about from Professor Kakodkar himself, he talks about something called the design spine. I think he did this for NIITs several years back. And that's the key to it, is that ability to have design thinking, multidisciplinary thinking, our ability to have multiple areas of specialization for people are the key to us in terms of making sure we get this holistic development of people who then can turn out to be entrepreneurs. Otherwise, they'll only become good mechanical engineers or good electrical engineers. Our ability also to bring about risk taking. I think today you see very low risk for low appetite for risk, as opposed to there is enormous amount of fear for risk in the minds of people. So that shift has to bring in the higher education. So therefore, is it the curriculum? It's the pedagogy. It's the culture. That's the first one I have. The second one is that we also need to monetize the research and development that we are doing. Enormous amount of work being done in the academic institutes at this point of time. No denying that the percentage of money being spent in R&D in this country is a fraction of what gets spent in the West. But that doesn't mean that look, whatever is even being spent at this point of time is well spent. My challenge is that I don't dispute at all that people do research for academic pursuits. They also do research for applied research. So therefore, if they just leave it, and we are seeing that the trend at this point of time in several education institutions, that they have as much as about 70% is more in the area of academic pursuit, as opposed to about 30% in applied research. But I think we need to monetize the effort that's going on. There is very good work being done, but doesn't get monetized at all. So therefore, I think, is there a way we can motivate people, incentivize our teaching staff or the professors or the PhD scholars in order to make sure that the work they're doing at this point of time has to be productized? Which in effect means that we need to have a much stronger relationship with the industry. So this industry academia research has to grow dramatically. And I think there's a good experience at IIT Chennai, where they created a research park. And in small ways, I think it's happening now with other IITs. Can we then do it much larger? My last point, I know if I'm running out of time, but I'll quickly finish off my last point, is the third one is we need to move into a mode of having more amount of cooperation as opposed to having competition. Somehow, I think starting with the JEEs, we have a competition intensely. No denying competition is important. Actually, we now have competition because we also rate all these education institutions across the country. There are NIRF ratings, as they're called. Several other ratings also come by. That is not bad at all. To me, the ability to compete is a good thing. But once the competition is over, we can also cooperate with each other. So it's a cooperative competition which will probably make the difference. So the point I like to make is, especially there are some of those leading edge technologies, which I think India has to become self-sufficient. And these are very good opportunities right now in front of us, whether it's to do with 5G, or it is to do with AI or IoT, or more importantly, the cyber physical systems. So therefore, can there be a cluster approach between the education institutions? That's the new norm that we have to get about, where we can probably get more deep domain knowledge as a nation, as opposed to saying one education institution will start putting effort to make it happen. So I'll rest my case by saying these three things I have. One is that we need to promote more amount of entrepreneurship, incubation, and innovation. The second one is that we need to monetize our research. The third one is that we need to have more amount of cooperation in addition to competition. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohan. And that's a great bringing together of various things. I'm going to start with some questions, but let me tell the audience right now, please put in your questions on the chat so that I can have a look at them. If necessary, invite you in, you can ask, or I can ask on your behalf. So please start adding questions to the thing. Let me first start with, Vijay talked about disruption. Professor Dr. Kakotkar talked about holistic education. Mohan talked about multidisciplinary, action-oriented graduation. So how disruptive should Indian education think of being? If you're going to, so if I were to say, and Vijay, this is really much more for you, given what we do now is what I like to call as the Mercedes model. We build Mercedeses and BMWs and then we let them out into the industry and we never service them for 40 years. That's our education model, right? Given 5G, AR, VR, and enormous changes that technology, how about shifting a majority of the higher education to lifelong learning, where people are working as they are, so they actually face multidisciplinary real problems, they solve them together, they understand. How drastic can we go? What's your, and after that I'll ask Dr. Kapoor, because he had also raised that, if there's so many different things that we want to accomplish, they cannot be accomplished with the status quo. So I want your ideas on how disruptive we can afford to be.
Excuses and say, what is this? Cautious optimism is not a word I'm going to use. I think we have the opportunity to be dramatically disruptive, and we are. I continue to work with projects in India with rural schools, and the capacity of the system to accommodate innovation is tremendous because the need is tremendous and the tendency to explore different approaches. So as a culture, it is there. I do see it and experience it. And I want to bring some color to your question about how disruptive. I said the disruption is around structural changes. And for instance, I talk about who learns, where they learn, what they learn. Do you have to go to an institute to get credentials? What we are seeing with technology is a disaggregation of on both the supply side as well as on the consumer side of education. So who educates? How do you modularize? How do you bundle various dimensions of the learning experience can be really disaggregated and spread out. And something that was just said by first of all, I believe that in some sense we are all displaced learners. Some of us are, and if anything, even with COVID, we are sitting at home. We are displaced from our workplace. We are displaced from other entities, and we are displaced, like I said, either vocationally. I'm in a job and I don't have access to the next set of upskilling opportunities that allow me to make a career change, or even, or just even change my job. I'm locationally displaced. I'm infrastructure displaced because I don't have access to resources. So designing what technology affords us is to look at displacement as a general condition for the learner and come up with limiting cases of this displacement. Some people, like I said, today's displacement is COVID. Yesterday's was the Syrian refugee crisis. Tomorrow's is global warming. Day after tomorrow is because labor markets are moved to different places. And what we have to do, and in the Indian context, this is particularly relevant now because we see these mass movements. What we have to see is how can I provide quality opportunities that combine technology and on-site to provide these different kinds of learn, to meet them where they are, so that this expectation that they have to come somewhere. Similarly, I want to think of the general condition of every learner, not just being displaced, but of being differently abled, which means that their preparation, some are, like I say, visually impaired, some are math impaired, right? Can we think of that as a defining condition and design experiences for differently able and displaced? And the agility that you talk about, that is needed. And I don't believe that in the current model, without changing who's a supplier, we can have the agility to address this, exploding need, which is a vectorial change, in what is needed and who needs to be served. And the point that I want to make is, and this is both enabled by technology and also by the kind of community solutions that it generates. And this, I'm going to pick up from an implication of what was said by Mohan just now, which is we have to start thinking about the we have to start thinking about the ecosystem of providers. I do not have to be, as an institution, the sole provider of every aspect of education. I can partner with industry, I can partner with other institutions in the value chain and look at how all these people become part of the provider ecosystem. And technology affords that connectivity and to do that. But the agility that is required is the structural change that is required is to move away from this, I am the institution, to the ecosystem is the institution that we all derive value from.
Thank you. I think that's a great, because that's what we are talking about. We are talking about how do we create an ecosystem rather than rely on each institution working in silo. That's going to give us some. While we are talking about all these futures, some of our viewers here are worried about day-to-day issues, and how they can manage it. So I'm going to ask Himali Chapia, if she's still on this thing, to ask her question. Himali, are you there? Can you come in, please?
Absolutely, I'm right here. Good evening, everyone. I was keen to understand, as Professor Vijay pointed out, that he spoke about the cracks in the foundation. One sees that in a lot of universities in India, these cracks are now very visible, and the academic year of 2019-20 has not closed, and a lot of the graduating students are going to be merely they're not going to be assessed and merely given mark sheets without any examinations. I wanted to know if the panel, I think all of you are very experienced, if you can tell us, graduating students without any kind of assessment, does that have an impact on their first job, and B, on the institution that is graduating them?
Can I go ahead, Ajit?
Please.
Yeah, I guess, this is a real problem at the IITs at this point of time. And what we decided to do at this juncture is that the graduating class of 2020 have already graduated themselves. That's basically, we ran the classes for a month, for the month of April, in spite of the lockdown. It was online, or it was through offline, or using even text messages, WhatsApp, phone calls. All these were used. Right. So therefore, if people had backlogs, I think that is also an associated question of yours, is that we said they should be, I think the exams were done by end of May. 15th of June, we have gone ahead and finalized the grading. And end of June, we decided who will be graduating. Actually, the plan is to have a virtual graduation by end of July. So therefore, people who have not finished off and have some backlogs, we're giving them one more opportunity. So they will definitely complete. And I don't think, it's coming up in your grade sheet saying that, whether you went through an exam or not. That's not all coming up. Final grade is being put on the grade sheet at this point of time. So that should not be of a major concern.
Thank you, Mohan. Coming back, and I think somebody mentioned this, I think it was Mohan, perhaps. We want our children to be innovative, we want them to be action-oriented, we want to be holistic. But the entrance exam, which is especially the IIT JEE, is increasingly forcing many parents, I think wrongly, but that's my opinion, to shift their children more and more to coaching classes. And I think Dr. Kakodkar talked about it, that the economy of this coaching classes is now as big as it's in which all ability to think holistically, all ability to think about different aspects, is all changed, and all that we think is every question in the world can be answered either as A, B, C, or D in 30 seconds, right? So how do we, I think, should we not also be disrupting our selection system?
Absolutely.
I think the answer is yes, Ajit, unhesitant about it. There should be methods of changing it, but still, it's an ongoing tussle that goes on. We can't probably change it so quickly. At least now having mains and then having an advanced, I think we continue to keep that going on. At least with the advanced part that came in, I think it's not 30 seconds A, B, C, D. It is little more than that. certainly I think we saw a change in the complexion of people who are coming in. But no denying at all, we can't stop this industry which is running tutorials. And I think Professor Kapotkar, yes, Kapotkar mentioned about it, saying that that industry is as large as the budget of India at this point of time, education of India. So therefore, I think we can't disrupt it so easily. They're also very strongly rooted. Their roots are much stronger than the foundation of Professor Vijay Kumar's home, and so therefore they can't be disturbed so easily at this point of time.
Yeah, may I just jump in for a second here? Because I think what you're asking plays directly into the previous question also about assessment. And we really, I mean, there's an expression, you are what you measure, right? And we notice this in our working. You can change a lot of pedagogical practice, advanced active learning, but if what we are assessing, both in a summative and formative sense, does not point to understanding how these kinds of tendencies, whether it is entrepreneurial tendencies or active learning tendencies, if the exams don't reflect those, then it's going to be not a systemic orientation or a disruptive change. And which is why, and we have seen various versions of this when people even graduate from institutions like IIT, but when they come to industry, people, first of all, have their own means of assessing who needs to be selected and then who needs to be provided with what kinds of skills changes so that they are training. And so that you don't confuse the input assessment, the selection criteria with the outcome assessment. So I think paying attention to that whole assessment regimen, what are we measuring, who are we measuring, is going to be extremely critical part of this disruption process.
So I'm going to.
Can I come in here?
Mohan Narayanan is sorry, was that Professor Kapotkar was saying something?
Yes.
So I was
thought
just a
let
little
me
conscious about the time that we have got just 7 minutes. So I'm first going to, if it's okay with you, may I just get one speaker and then come back to you? So Mohan Narayanan, are you there?
Yes, I am there. Good evening. And thanks for the brilliant discussion by all the panel speakers. I think all of you have addressed at a macro level, at a structural level, what are the things that can be done from a higher education perspective. Now, I just want to restate and go back to a very well-known problem, which is, see, we have, let's take engineering education. We have over 5 lakh students who graduate every year. Now, out of that, let us keep in mind that IITs, NITs, that is a centrally funded institution, probably account for about 25 or 30,000 of them. The remaining maybe 4.5, I may be a little off the mark, but around 4.5 lakh students come out of other state level engineering.
Yeah.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, go on.
Yeah. So out of these, 4.5 lakh students come out of tier 2, tier 3 engineering colleges. Now we run an initiative as alumni of various IITs to work with those engineering colleges. And then we have found that a big part of the problem there is not actually students, but faculty. And the reason is, of course, not because they are not good, but because of various other issues in terms of compensation, in terms of opportunities, and in terms of the fact that the best of the students hence don't become teachers. Now the question to you, and any of you can answer this, is, has COVID created an opportunity for us, and probably a lifetime opportunity to completely reboot the engineering education as run by the state universities? Because now we have an opportunity where we can get access to the best of the faculty worldwide to teach on an online platform, and with the local faculty being probably as administrators or messengers. And then we also have the capability to do online assessments and testing and even online proctoring. So this probably gives, while organic development has happened, this probably gives an opportunity to completely do an inorganic stuff and reboot the whole thing. As policy makers, what can be done now?
Can I take that?
Do you want to answer?
Sure. I would like
Yes.
all the three to answer if possible.
Well, let me, of course, I got disconnected in between, so I haven't heard the full question, but I got a sense of it and I'll respond on that basis. I think this is also a same problem, the cracks in the foundation of our education system. IITs are doing great, but as was pointed out, the number of students come out of IITs is a very small fraction, maybe 10% of total engineers that we produce. And what about the quality of other engineers that we produce? And so there is a huge difference between the career opportunities for an IIT graduate vis-a-vis career opportunities for a graduate coming out from an ordinary engineering college. I think we need to fix that. And if that, I talked about disparities, this also is too much of a disparity in quality. And then everybody wants to rush for IIT, so you have coaching class problem. So I think we need to fix this problem at its roots. A similar thing was said earlier with regard to the quality of our older education institutions, universities. And there again, it's same thing. No, we create a lot of new institutions, but not worry so much about the old institutions. And I can tell you from my experience, for example, at University of Mumbai, we have set up a center of excellence in basic sciences, which is which does more or less the same thing as ICERs do. And you can set that up at 1/10 the cost because all the infrastructure exists. And it is making a big impact on an existing university. I think we need to adopt such models where the quality of existing institutions remains rejuvenated. The third problem of a similar class is this, again, I mentioned the village and city disparities. And there again, I think we need to have a good disruption. Today we are talking about IT. Today we are talking about knowledge technologies. So why is it that when we look at villages, we look at only in the context of agriculture and allied activities? Why can't we think whatever somebody can do sitting in a city, why can't the same person do same or equal in a village? So in a village, I think today's environment allows opportunities in agriculture, in industry, and in knowledge area, whereas cities is only the two. So according to me, there are higher opportunities in villages, but average income in villages is just half. So I think we need to fix these problems. These are the disruptions that we need to handle. And the last point, last point I wish.
9:29,
okay.
And I think in 1 minute we have to close.
Okay, so I stop.
I'm afraid. I'm sorry. Mohan, I think all I can say is a simple answer is yes. COVID does not COVID, but this digitization will give us an opportunity to raise the quality. Yeah. I just want to thank Dr. Kakodkar, and my apologies, sir, that the time was not enough. Unfortunately, you dropped off, so we couldn't continue with that discussion. Thank you, Mohan, as always, and thank you, Vijay. It's been a wonderful, exciting discussion. I wish we could have gone on and on, but we shall hopefully continue this another time. Thank you, PanIIT, for having us, and all the best.
Thank you very much. We hope to connect. Bye.
Thank you.